I am your host, James Morgan, and this is History of Cities. Episode 20 The Pen and the Sword. We last left off with the crowning of Justinian and Theodora as Emperor and Empress of the Byzantine Empire. Before we return to the narrative, it is necessary to lay some groundwork for our next few episodes. Like Constantine, Justinian's reign was extremely transformative for Constantinople, and both the length of his tenure and his ambition leave us with a mountain of history to go through. It is difficult to simply just go through the major events one at a time in chronological order, since many of them lasted for a number of years and overlapped with other events. Another way we could structure the episodes is by dissecting his administration into topics like religion, war, economy, etc., but I think that will cause the linear progression of Justinian's policy to be lost. The way forward will therefore be a hybrid system that tries to take the best of either approach. We will introduce each event as they happened in chronological order, but we will not move on to the next one until we have explored the event fully. This will require the listener to be extra attentive to dates, but I think it is a compromise that will make sure each event gets its full due process. With all that out of the way, we will now dive into the era of Justinian and Theodora. Well, of course, it wasn't just the two of them running the empire. They were more like the head chefs of the restaurant, and they had a gaggle of underlings who heard the policy orders of the day, said yes, chef, and got to work implementing them. Among the most well-known of these underlings were Tribonian the lawyer, Peter the foreign affairs expert, John the Cappadocian, who was tasked with squeezing every penny he could out of the empire, and Belisarius and Narses, the generals who would see out Justinian's grand ambition to reclaim all the lost Roman territory. As talented and intelligent both Theodora and Justinian were, they could not have done half the things they wanted to do without the help of these men. Even with their help, the road was not smooth for the duration of Justinian's time on the throne, and as we will see, he faced more challenges than any of his other successors, sometimes due to forces out of his control, but other times because of his own personal blind spots. It seems natural to set out on this rocky road from the beginning. Justinian was eager to realize his dream of reuniting the entire Roman Empire and bringing it into a new golden age. This dream is not original to Justinian, as almost every European ruler living in the shadow of the Roman Empire has sought in some way to revitalize the glory of that romanticized lost heritage. He found, however, that his efforts to modernize and make the state efficient enough to complete such a monumental task were being hindered by its own laws. The legal system made ruling the empire as awkward and lethargic as wading through molasses. To overcome this hindrance, there would need to be a complete overhaul and standardization of the law of the land. This would be the grease that made every cog of the imperial machine run smoother and make everything easier. To this end, Justinian turned to the man he saw as the most brilliant legal mind of his day to head a committee to write a new law code. This man was Tribonian the Greek. Tribonian was not the kind of official that many good upstanding citizens of the capital revered. He was famously corrupt, allowing people to change laws to their liking in return for a small bribe. Worst of all, he was a pagan, something that, at least in Constantinople, had fallen completely out of fashion. Despite his less than stellar reputation, Tribonian was undoubtedly a legal genius, who was unrivaled in his knowledge of Byzantine law. That was all that Justinian cared about, and so in 529, Tribonian was appointed quaestor, or head of the legal ministry, and his committee was set the task of collecting all the laws of all the provinces of the empire, sifting through them, making sure they lined up with each other, and then organizing them into a relatively easy-to-digest book for universal use throughout the empire. What Justinian was asking for was nothing short of a miracle. There was a reason why all the emperors, dating back to Theodosius II and his Codex Theodosianus, had simply accepted the incomprehensible chaos of the legal system. That reason was that the task of unraveling the web of contradicting laws seemed impossible, no matter how much of a genius you had running the show. But after only 14 months of work, the first edition of the Code of Justinian was given to the emperor for his approval. The document had 3 complete parts. First completed in 529 was the Codex, for which the document gets its common name of the Code of Justinian, and included all the imperial decrees that had been enacted up until 529, though I'm sure Tribonian had more than a few decrees that he left on the cutting room floor. The second part was introduced in 530 and was called the Digest. It had every ruling that imperial judges had promulgated during the same time frame as the imperial decrees. These two parts combined were a complete encyclopedia of the laws that governed the empire, and they were the only laws that could be referenced when new rulings were made. The third part of the document was the Institutes, and it was finally completed in 533. The Institutes was an academic handbook that was used by legal colleges to teach their students about the code and how it should be used to standardize the law. With the inclusion of the Institutes, Tribonian and his people's work was complete, and the Byzantine Empire had a new legal code to ensure that the imperial machine was well oiled and molasses-free. But Justinian was not quite done with the code. After he had signed off on the first three parts, he added a few blank pages on the back end. This fourth and final section of the code was the Novellae Constitutiones, or New Laws. It would be a space where all future decrees of the crown would be recorded and become an unchangeable part of the legal framework. The mind behind the conception of these new laws would be Justinian, but he relied on Tribonian to turn his ideas into coherent legal decrees. It is without a doubt that Tribonian was indispensable during the first part of Justinian's reign, but he never stopped being controversial. In 532 he was fired from his post as quaestor, though he still remained a part of the group that drafted the digests and institutes. His removal from office was due to charges of corruption levied at him during a particularly tense period of Justinian's reign that we will go over in more detail in the future. Justinian did not want to provoke the opposition at this time, and so he bowed to their demands and had Tribonian sidelined. However, when the tension passed and Justinian was in a stronger position politically, he had Tribonian reinstated as quaestor in 535. By this point, the work on the Code of Justinian had been completed, but the emperor still needed Tribonian's legal genius to help legitimize his policies within the system of laws. From our outside perspective as students of history, we can see how important Tribonian was to the success of Justinian, but contemporaries of the corrupt lawyer were often laser-focused on the issue of corruption that he embodied. Throughout history, and certainly during the reign of Justinian, the bureaucracy was a machine that was powered by money. If you wanted it to work in your favor, you had to feed it cash, and to those without the funds to do this, there was no greater sin. If the supposed impartial law that extended to all citizens equal treatment under it could be twisted to serve someone's agenda just because they were wealthy, then what was the point of government at all? Tribonian was far from the most corrupt, and his achievement in codifying the law outshines his dubious actions in hindsight, but that did not stop his peers from pinning all their grievances with the way the government ran on him. Justinian was an effective ruler, but he was not exactly popular. Tribonian was just one of the reasons the people of Constantinople had a complicated relationship with the emperor. As we move on from the Code of Justinian and Tribonian, I need to make another point of order. I debated over whether or not I should include all the foreign wars that the Byzantine Empire was involved in during Justinian's reign, as they do not directly affect Constantinople, which still remains our principal subject. In the end, I came to the conclusion that although these conflicts are a bit out of scope at the present moment we are in, they provide important context for the future of Constantinople. Subjects of history are often shaped by events far outside their immediate surroundings, and an event that seemed insignificant at the time could become the pebble that starts the avalanche that changes the face of the historical landscape dramatically. To summarize, we will be going over Justinian's wars. I believe they are necessary in understanding the full history of Constantinople. Justinian's first conflict started before he was emperor, but he didn't really dive into it until after the Code of Justinian was in progress. I talked last episode about Justin's diplomatic mission to chip away at the Persian grip over its client states. He saw the Christian kingdoms that were subject to the Zoroastrian king as a crack in the Persians' borders' defenses. One such kingdom that Justin tried to wrestle away from Kavad I was the Georgian kingdom of Iberia. Now, those of you versed in geography will likely recognize Iberia as the name of the peninsula where modern-day Spain and Portugal are located. Well, Iberia in the Caucasus has absolutely nothing to do with that peninsula. It's just another instance of confusing names in history. Anyway, with Justin's pledge to defend the Christians within the Persian Empire, the Iberians took the opportunity to declare themselves in revolt over their heathen overlords in 523. At first, the Byzantines were non-committal to the operation and only sent Hunnic mercenaries to aid the Iberians. During the final years of Justin's life, the war in the Caucasus was a series of failures for the Byzantines. The revolts in Iberia and the neighboring Christian nation of Lazica were crushed, and the Persians began threatening the Byzantine border in order to extract concessions from the dying emperor. But before Justin could throw in the towel on the Iberian War, he passed away and was succeeded by Justinian. The change in leadership saw a revitalization of the war effort, as Justinian reorganized the armies of the East in an attempt to reverse the tide of the war. It was at this point that we must introduce another member of the Justinian and Theodora super team. This man is perhaps the most important member of the group outside of the royal couple. His relationship with Justinian is longer and even more of a roller coaster than that of the emperor and the empress. He was the newly appointed general of the Eastern Army, a man named Belisarius. After his time, historians will romanticize Belisarius as the last of the great conquering Roman generals, the last of a prestigious group that includes the likes of Julius Caesar and Constantine. But for now, in the Iberian War, he has known nothing but failure. Belisarius's military career began as a personal bodyguard to Justin. As he proved himself to be a talented leader and tactician, his responsibilities were expanded until he eventually came to command a heavy cavalry unit of about 7,000 men. The unit was under his personal command and would follow him throughout his career, becoming one of the most decorated groups in the Byzantine army. Belisarius was not a one-trick pony, and he relied on having an abundance of options to make the right choice for each battle. Because of this needed flexibility, his unit, nicknamed the Bucellari, or Biscuit Eaters, came equipped with a variety of weapons that allowed them to adapt to any situation. In this way, they differed from the rest of the army, which was modeled after Roman traditions. They were more akin to the enemies that the Byzantines had been fighting in the Balkans for years. As the war in the Caucasus dragged on, Belisarius and his unique cavalry were called upon by Justinian to relieve the Hunnic mercenaries that had been fighting in Constantinople's name and bring a swift conclusion to the conflict. During the first few years of the campaign, Belisarius seemed better equipped to raid Persian settlements along the frontier than to face the enemy on the battlefield. Despite his success in harassing the supply lines and villages of the Sassanids, Belisarius was soundly defeated in the first 3 major engagements he took part in as an independent commander. But Justinian was not swayed by the dismal results his friend had put up thus far. After Justin passed away and Justinian took full control of the war effort, he placed Belisarius in overall command of the entire Eastern Army. His first task was to defend the important city of Dara. By now, the war had spread far from the kingdom of Iberia, and Dara stood at the southern border of Anatolia. If it fell, then the Persians would be able to sweep into Byzantine territory from the east and the south, and so Belisarius could not let the city succumb to the 40,000 Sassanids that threatened it. Unfortunately, the Byzantines could only spare 25,000 men to defend the fortress, and when they arrived in Dara, the Persians responded by sending an additional 10,000 reinforcements. Already outnumbered and now expecting even more enemies to arrive, Belisarius' only hope was to hold out behind the walls long enough for the Persians to either give up or for Justinian to send another army. But Belisarius decided to throw conventional wisdom and caution to the wind and set his troops into formation outside the city in preparation for a decisive engagement with the Persians. Belisarius' plan relied on the assumption that the Persians were extremely dismissive of his army. Not only did the Sassanids outnumber the Byzantines, they also had the evidence of many past battles that showed that their troops greatly outmatched the Byzantines in quality. To some extent, Belisarius agreed with this assessment of his strength, but he had learned from his defeats and believed that the overconfidence of the Persians would allow him to draw them into a trap. His trap was a tactical formation that the Persians had used against him 2 years ago, which he now adopted, hoping that the enemy would not know how to exploit their own tactic. The formation was built around a series of trenches, where the two flanks would be presented a little closer to the enemy than the center. Gaps were left in the trench line to allow for Byzantine cavalry to assist as needed during the battle. With this specific formation, the goal was to goad the enemy into attacking the center so that the protruding wings could pivot and surround the enemy. The addition of the gaps in the trench line allowed the army to be more flexible and to respond to any given situation that should arise during the battle. Belisarius put his Byzantine infantry in the center, as they were the weakest portion of his army and thus offered the juiciest bait for the Persians. On the flanks he placed the Byzantine cavalry, also not a very impressive bunch of men, who he hoped would further entice the Persians into attacking. The real trick of the operation came from the cavalry that Belisarius held in reserve. On the flanks he reinforced them with divisions of Hunnic mercenary horsemen, who were much more fearsome than their Byzantine counterparts, and in the center he commanded his own Bucalari in hopes that they would prove the decisive factor in the battle. The Persians were surprised when their scouts reported that the Byzantines were outside the city walls and lined up for the slaughter. Not ones to look a gift horse in the mouth, the Persian commanders marched their 40,000, soon to be 50,000 men, within 3 kilometers of Dara. The first day of the face-off did not see the main bodies of the armies engaging each other. Instead, there were a series of single combat exhibitions, which according to differing sources were either quite dramatic or dreadfully unimpressive. Nonetheless, they were completely inconsequential to the outcome of the battle. The next day, the Persian reinforcements arrived and confirmed, at least to any sane observer, the inevitable victory of the Sassanids. Now that they outnumbered Belisarius' men 2-1, the Persians began their offensive. They started by softening the Byzantine lines with a barrage of arrows, to which the defenders answered in kind. This exchange lasted until about midday, when the Persians decided to form up into 2 columns to hit the Byzantine flanks. By now the sun was beating down on the battlefield, and since it was the height of summer, the temperature was in excess of 100 degrees Fahrenheit or 38 degrees Celsius. Despite the miserable heat, both sides remained in the field to ensure that the fate of Dara would be decided on that day. The first Persian push came on the Byzantine left flank, where they overcame the trenches and pushed the cavalry into a retreat. This was exactly what Belisarius had expected and hoped for, as now the Persian column was out of position and vulnerable to counterattack. The counter came from both the left and the right of the Persian column, as the Huns raced to relieve their Byzantine comrades. They successfully routed the Persians and secured the left half of the battlefield. Meanwhile, on the right flank, the Persians' elite cavalry units, known as the Immortals, had easily overcome the Byzantine defenses and threatened to crash into the side of the infantry center, a maneuver that would have surely seen the Byzantines slaughtered. But Belisarius had expected this to happen as well, and his Bucalari cavalry were in perfect position to counter the Immortals' advance. Belisarius' charge managed to split the Persian column in half. One half continued to pursue the retreating Byzantine cavalry, but that meant that the other half was surrounded by Huns and Bucalari. These trapped Persians, around 5,000 men and their commanders, were ruthlessly massacred. After both flanks were secured by the Byzantines, the dead were counted and the Persians retreated from their position, ceding the battle to Belisarius. In some ways, the Battle of Dara echoes the first battle in this series that we explored in detail, the Battle of Marathon. In both instances, the Persian army was defeated by an inferior force that learned from their past defeats and used superior tactical planning to overcome their weaknesses. The defeat of the Persians at the Battle of Dara allowed the Byzantines to regain their footing in a war that was quickly slipping towards a resounding defeat, much in the same way the Greeks had staved off total annexations by the Persians at the Battle of Marathon. After the Battle of Dara, the armies of the two empires remained in the field, and there were repeated attempts by the Persians to break through the border defenses in Byzantine Anatolia. As the Persian armies probed at the border and were again defeated in a set-piece battle, this time by Belisarius' colleagues at the Battle of Satala. They were eventually forced to try and circumvent the Byzantines by taking a route through Byzantine Syria that they had never taken before. While this was all being planned and executed, there were ongoing peace negotiations between representatives of Justinian and those of Kavad. The two defeats at Dara and Satala had brought the Persians to the negotiating table and put Justinian in a pretty good position to extract favorable terms from them. Still, Kavad was dragging his feet in hopes that this final offensive through an unconventional route would give him some leverage. In 531, the Persian army broke through the line and began moving deeper into Byzantine territory. Belisarius was still the overall commander of the eastern forces, and it was up to him to repulse this attack. But he was unsure as to whether the attack was even real. From his point of view, the war was drawing to a close. The Persians had been spooked by their defeats at the hands of the Byzantines, and they had never marched their armies this way before. Eventually, he decided it was better to be safe than sorry, and he rallied 20,000 of his men, plus 5,000 Arab allies, to engage the enemy. When the Persians received word that Belisarius was on his way to their position, they at first wanted to stand and face him. They then saw that Belisarius would have a massive strategic advantage as the one attacking, and there was not any good defensive ground nearby to stand on. So the Persians were forced to retreat, and it seemed like Belisarius had ended the offensive, and maybe even the war, without having to shed any blood. At this point, however, the Byzantine and Arab soldiers had their blood running hot, and they demanded that their commander chase down the Persian invaders and punish them for their insolence. Facing a potential mutiny, Belisarius complied and his army pursued the Persians, who they outnumbered slightly. The two forces finally collided across the Euphrates River from the nearby town of Callinicum on the Saturday before Easter in the year 531. The battle would have taken place on Easter, but both armies had significant contingents of Christian soldiers who would be fasting as was their custom. Neither side wanted to fight on an empty stomach, and so the two commanders agreed to face each other on Saturday rather than wait. This change in date arguably favored the Persians, as Belisarius needed the extra time to figure out the most effective way to use his numerical advantage. But he was still worried about the potential mutiny, and so he told his restless men to form up on Saturday to go into battle. As is often the case in set-piece battles, the pre-battle formations of each side played a large role in the overall outcome. Belisarius chose to deploy in a somewhat opposite way than he had at Dara. At Callinicum, he chose to keep his strongest forces under his command at the center, while the wings were composed of relatively less reliable allied troops under the leadership of their various commanders. What Belisarius was going for here was essentially a gamble that his opponent would weaken his centers in hopes of having his wings envelop Belisarius. If the Persians did this, then Belisarius could break their weak center and split the army in two, and hopefully cause a rout. All he needed was for his flanks to hold out for a little bit so that he was not surrounded. Across the battlefield, the Persian commander Zarathus had a different idea for how he saw the battle playing out. He knew that he was already at a disadvantage number-wise, so he couldn't afford to leave any part of his line weak at the risk of his army being split or entirely overwhelmed. From his perspective, his chances were best if he distributed his men equally across the whole line and hoped that their bravery would make up for the difference in numbers. Just like at Dara, the battle began with an exchange of arrow volleys from both sides. According to some sources, the Persians saw more success during this phase than their Byzantine counterparts due to their archers' superior skill. Other sources say that it was more of a draw, as the bow and arrow technology of the Byzantines gave their missiles more penetrative power and were thus more deadly. After both sides had softened each other up with arrows, the cavalry and infantry marched forward to engage in a brutal melee. To Belisarius' disliking, his center did not immediately overcome the expectedly weaker center of the Persians. Both sides settled into a bloody stalemate that lasted into the afternoon. But time was on the side of the Persians. As the battle continued, Zarathus would eventually notice how weak the Byzantine flanks were and exploit this to great effect. When he finally saw his opportunity on the Byzantine right flank, he redeployed his reserves to punch through the Arab cavalry stationed there. His maneuver was a resounding success, and the Arabs were quickly routed. Without cavalry on the right flank to counter a charge, the infantry in Belisarius' center were also quickly routed by the Persian horsemen. At this point, Belisarius saw that it was hopeless and fled the field, leaving his left flank to continue fighting for their lives. Despite the fact that this left flank was now alone, with their backs pressed against the Euphrates River, they bravely formed a defensive U formation and held out until nightfall, when the Persians were forced to leave the field for lack of visibility, and the Byzantine survivors were able to slip away. In the end, the Persians had beaten the odds and come out victorious at the Battle of Callinicum. However, it was a Pyrrhic victory, as they had lost so many men and horses, especially against the final holdout of the Byzantine left flank, that they were in no shape to continue their invasion of Syria. So both the Byzantines and the Persians got something they wanted out of the battle. For the Byzantines, though they too had lost so much of their army that they were completely incapacitated, they had achieved their goal of preventing a Persian incursion into Syria and Anatolia. For the Persians, the victory at Callinicum helped erase the bad memories of Dara and Satala, and gave them the leverage to break off peace negotiations. For Belisarius, Callinicum could have been the end of his career. A formal investigation was made into his defeats at Thanurius and Callinicum. Although the inquiry eventually found that Belisarius had acted to the best of his ability, and the blame for the defeats was not to be placed on him, he was still removed as overall commander of the East and recalled to Constantinople. It is unsure whether Justinian really thought that removing Belisarius from the East would improve the situation there, or if he just wanted his most trusted general with him in the capital to help plan his future moves at retaking the Western Empire. Whatever the case, the war against the Sassanids would continue without Belisarius, but with both the Persian and the Byzantine armies in shambles, it became more of a phony war. Gavad still believed that he could gain huge concessions from the Byzantines if he continued fighting, but the rest of his court saw that this war was draining the empire's resources and it was an exercise in futility. Finally, in 532, Gavad died and was succeeded by his son Khosrow, who immediately reopened negotiations with Justinian. The agreement the two rulers came to was called the Eternal Peace, and it relinquished control of all the captured Byzantine cities back to Justinian at the price of 11,000 pounds of gold. The kingdom of Iberia that sparked this whole conflict remained under the Persian sphere of influence, but the treaty allowed for those that had fled their homes to return, or to stay in Byzantium. Justinian was glad to be rid of this thorn in his eastern side, as he had grand ambition for a reconquest of the West and growing troubles at home in Constantinople. But that will be a story for next episode. We are far from the end of Justinian's story, but I think this is a good stopping point for our first episode on his lengthy and eventful reign. In this episode, we went over the two most important responsibilities a monarch has, those of civil service and those as commander of the military. Often in popular discussions of history, people tend to fixate on the wars and battles that a ruler fights, while neglecting to see the importance of domestic policy. I don't blame people for this tendency. Who in their right mind would want to see a 3-hour film adaptation of a bunch of medieval lawyers sifting through esoteric legal documents in a dimly lit catacomb? The importance of such work, though it is quite dull, should not be overlooked when considering the course of history. The Code of Justinian arguably had a much larger impact on the trajectory of history than the Iberian War. Just keep that in mind as we move further through our narrative. As always, if you have any questions or think I missed anything, please feel free to email me at hofcpod.cast@gmail.com or DM me on Twitter at HOFC_podcast. Thank you for listening to this episode, and please join me next time for the history of Constantinople.